Hey folks, welcome back to the 60-second DarkHorse Podcast live stream Q&A in the middle of whatever it is that's taking place.
Yep, that's right. Well, we got cat madness.
We do have cat madness. For those of you who watched the initial part of the broadcast, let me just say I have looked, and that Harper's article that we were talking about does indeed look like it's from 2018, although in my defense, the article itself does not have a date on it. So the fact that the author tweeted it today led me to think this was current. So anyway, I'm sure what he said is true, but nonetheless, it's a couple of years back.
And like I said, I'm familiar. We are decades old subscriber to Harper's, and Walter Kern has written many of those opening essays, and it's really quite excellent. So I did not know that he was no longer writing for Harper's. I hadn't noticed. So there's been a lot going on.
There has been a lot going on.
Yes. Even though it's 2 years ago, I get 2+ years ago at this point. But anyway, I recommend for people who aren't familiar with him, finding his writing. He's quite good. Walter Kern. All right, let us begin with a few questions from episode 61, question from the Discord, and then move into questions from last hour. HMOs are now woke. How can one get safe healthcare now? Do we let our diseases play out caveman style, or are we not there yet? I'm in California, incidentally, on HMO through Medicaid expansion with several conditions. So this, obviously, what is it? How are we supposed to get healthcare? And it's not just the healthcare question, but the insurance question sort of all tied up. This is a many lifetimes question.
Yes.
You got to...
Well, what I would say, I think you're headed in exactly the right direction, which is, yes, this is very frightening when it comes to healthcare. It's also very frightening when it comes to everything else.
Mm-hmm.
And the very fact, we have banking that is not immune to this. We have, the ability to source basic human needs. And the problem, as we were alluding to in the initial part of the podcast, is that the dangerous ideology that appears to want to control access to well-being and shunt it this way and away from that way, and is pursuing something it calls equity, and then all of that.
Yeah.
That ideology is unfortunately being emboldened by the conservative response that says private property rights are paramount. And private property rights are important, but to make them paramount and make everything else subservient to them effectively means that, as I was talking to a good friend of ours yesterday, you may have the right to drive on the road because it's public, but that doesn't mean you have the right to tires, right? Tires are not public. And so in a world where...
that's good.
Yeah, I think the point is reducto ad absurdum is really the thing that you need to avail yourself of, because we're headed in such an absurdum direction that, we're going to land in these places.
That's not how Latin works, right?
It is now.
Okay.
Because the Romans...
Who's going to stop you?
Yeah, exactly. The pharmacists, I don't see that happening. So...
Yeah. I guess I had two comments about this question that are not exactly what you said. And I don't at the moment remember the second one. The first one with regard to, do we let our diseases play out caveman style, or are we not there yet? I have said, and you have as well, for many, many years, that Western medicine has a few amazing successes, and with those few amazing successes, it has imagined that it actually knows more than it really does. And those amazing successes come in two broad categories. One is sort of surgery, knife work, and the other is the pretty narrow slice of pharmaceutical interventions that are antibiotics and vaccines. And, I say that, even, with our conversations about vaccines that we've been having, but like really antibiotics and vaccines and surgery in combination, and, and things like a germ theory of disease. And, before many of the things about what pharmaceuticals can do for us got over applied and rendered doctors sort of script readers and script givers, many many more medical doctors, I think, were great diagnosticians, which is what, we need. We need scientists doing medicine as opposed to people who have memorized a book of symptoms that may or may not have been described through an actual scientific process. So if you have a condition that is actually going to benefit from an antibiotic or vaccine or from surgery, you should absolutely find the best primary healthcare provider you can, and allow them to know you well enough such that they will be able to tell you when, in fact, you have, for instance, a bacterial infection that warrants an antibiotic, or you're going to a place that you need, these vaccines, whatever it is. I have found, and this again is a books long, careers long, certainly many more than a couple of sentences long conversation that is warranted, but in the wake of two major medical things that happened to me 5 years ago now, when I ruptured my Achilles tendon playing ultimate frisbee, and then 4.5 years ago, almost dying in the Galapagos on a boat accident, which caused such all body destruction across almost every system except my head. I have found so many healthcare providers who don't come looking the way that we are told healthcare providers, the most excellent healthcare providers, are necessarily going to look. And this ranges from an amazing DO, DO being an alternative degree to MD, which has all of the same privileges even in terms of like prescription granting, but just is coming from a tradition that spends more time with patients and is more hands-on, through all manner of, there are certainly lots of quacks out there in every realm, but an excellent physical therapist or chiropractor or even acupuncturist, structural integration therapist, all of these things, myofascial release, have the ability to actually understand the health of a system, of a body, more than a doctor with a prescription pad and 10 minutes to hear what your complaint is and assess whether or not they have that in their in their file. That said, most modern insurance won't pay for all of these alternative practices, and so we're really kind of screwed, honestly.
All right, I want to say two things as follow-up to that. One, or maybe it's three things. One is, I know you to be somebody who will try things that people find effective and reject them when they don't work.
Yeah,
so
there's several things I've tried that
to the extent
I'm not naming. Yep.
you are not kidding yourself, because I definitely know you to come back from such things and say, no, I don't think that helped.
Yep.
Second thing is the comparison to so-called cavemen is an interesting one. It cuts both ways.
Yeah.
And your caveman ancestors, your Pleistocene ancestors, would have been thoroughly jeopardized by bacterial infections, right? Mm-hmm. A wound could be very serious because it could turn to gangrene, which can kill you very easily. The ability to treat such things with antibiotics is amazingly powerful, a huge gift.
Yep.
But this modern world that has given us antibiotics has also given us things like air travel. So the extent to which we are far sicker, far more regularly, because we are in contact with all of these things that would be circulating in some little place and you'd never hear of them, but suddenly they're everywhere. It has robbed us, the modern world has robbed us, even as it has given us new tools to fight disease. It has given us a great many more diseases that we have to worry about. So that's significant. I also want to say, I of course agree and have said that basically medicine has these great successes, vaccines, antibiotics, and surgery being the most major of them. But I want to point out that each of those is actually us utilizing a built-in biological near miracle, right, and wielding it well. The antibiotics are chemical warfare agents that are being made by bacteria and fungi to fight each other, and we can use them to fight on our behalf. Surgery is basically entirely dependent on the magical process of wound healing, in which we can actually cut into you, remove a tumor, and then you will magically, reassemble yourself in a way that, if you think about doing such a thing on a car or an airplane, is you'll realize just how amazing it is that your body has this this capacity. So anyway, I guess the point is, and vaccines trade on the ability of the immune system to be alerted ahead of time to something that it would ordinarily just acquire information about through getting sick. So anyway, we do this, but we're using medicine at its best is basically surfing a beautiful biological substrate that evolved and is there for us to improve
working
upon.
in concert with our bodies, as opposed to acting like an engineer and going like, how can I brute force this thing into submission?
Right. Yeah. The arrogance of thinking that what we're doing is taking a biological system that ain't so great and intervening in a way that makes it better. That's just it's a garbage nonsense notion, and we should get over it.
Well, I mean, it comes from the same people who say things like we only use 10% of our brains, and a vast majority of people have a chemical imbalance in their brains that needs to be fixed with exogenous drugs. Like, really? You must not have been around for very long or understand anything about science or evolution if you believe either of those things.
Well, I've come to a different conclusion about the claim that we use 10% of our brains. I think people who say that are, when they say it, using about 10% of their
Only when they say it, though.
brain.
Yeah, no, you're being generous.
Well, some of them say it a lot, so.
Next question. Doesn't the politically driven, narrative-maintaining withholding of a known effective treatment, prophylactic, like Ivermectin, arguably amount to negligent manslaughter? How many would still be alive if given early treatment? So this, again, is from last episode when we spent some time talking about Ivermectin last week.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would say potentially. So here's what I want everybody to get the nuance. The job of deciding what drugs might possibly be wielded, what evidence is sufficient in order to justify them being prescribed. This is not a job you want, right? Because you will kill people no matter what you do, right? And there are lots of jobs that are true, that for which this is true. But my point would be, this is a job that is impossible to do perfectly. And that means people will die as a result of whatever decisions you make. On the other hand, it doesn't mean that you can't make those decisions really, really badly, either as the result of ineptitude or more likely as a result of corruptions in the system that cause you to see things one way when you should see them another way. And so I don't know why, hey, it's possible that the information we have on ivermectin is actually misleading in some way that we don't know. It's possible that there's something we could see that would cause us to evaluate what we think we know. On the other hand, if the evidence that we've seen is representative, then it does appear that at least we have gross negligence that is going to result in lots of loss of health and loss of life. So yes, potentially is the answer, not necessarily.
Good. What are the evolutionary reasons for comedy and laughter in general? And how did, with time, people come to appreciate dark humor? So again, excuse me, every week I pick some of the ones that we weren't able to get to the previous week. And because I'm going through the sometimes dozens of questions we weren't able to get to, these are often ones that we should want to spend many hours on, but we only have a couple of minutes. So
I can't remember exactly when it was, but I advanced a hypothesis on the meaning of laughter and humor at least a decade ago. And as I was describing it to somebody, they actually pointed to a quote that wasn't exactly identical to it, but certainly was in the same neighborhood. And it was Tom Stoppard, who said, laughter is the sound of comprehension. And
that's beautiful. I hope that's true. Tom Stoppard is one of my favorites.
Yeah. And it's exactly a Tom Stoppard kind of insight. So anyway, the hypothesis that I deployed was that effectively, the thing to pay attention to is comedy timing, which I'm not going to claim to understand. I don't think anybody understands it really. There are some experts in wielding it, but as to what exactly it's made of.
Well, you can't do it explicitly, right? Like you're not, if you go conscious on it, it's like catching a Frisbee consciously.
Yes, but I don't even think that an expert in it can describe what it is that makes for excellent timing and what it is that makes for just slightly off timing that causes a joke to fall flat.
But it's, you know it when you see it.
Right. So in any case, what I would say is that funny things are things at the fringe of consciousness. That is to say, they are things that we are conscious of to one degree or another, but we are very often not conscious that others are conscious of it too. And so when somebody says something that is funny, such that a room or a group erupts in laughter, what it effectively is a bunch of people signing on to the recognition that, yes, they are aware of the same little oddity. And if one attempts to be part of the group by signing on to these things, by laughing when you don't really understand what it is that's being said, you will out yourself, right? Because you will laugh incorrectly. And the point is, there is something, the way that I always, when I make a joke and it's really good, right, I have the sense that it causes a kind of whiplash. The brain thinks it's going in this direction, and then suddenly it changes direction and it realizes, oh, that's not what it was. And that whiplash, the sort of the snap of it is what makes the joke really funny. And so if you bungle the timing, it's, sort of like, you ooze around the curve.
But you're making a population level analysis. There's two things here, right? There's what it does to reveal an individual's comprehension per Stoppard's observation, but then it's about unifying and synchronizing a group such that not only are people who aren't in the same kind of know reveal themselves as not being in the same kind of know, but you also become more synchronous going forward and maybe better able to deal with an enemy, hunt whatever it is, come together and make an important political decision for the group, whatever it is, right?
Yes, well, it goes with the hypothesis, which we have outlined in various places and is in our upcoming book, about the nature of consciousness itself, that consciousness is most fundamentally collective and that individual consciousness is secondary. And so, yes, what is a group made of? It's a group of people who basically share conscious space. And how do you bump out the edge of some part of that consciousness? Well, often we do it with humor. We tread around the edges of things that aren't quite understood or aren't quite comfortable to talk about. And somebody who does it well, if you think about what the classic comedian does, right? They spend their life thinking about things that the rest of us find mundane and noticing, if you didn't find that mundane and you thought carefully about it, you'd realize how absurd you look doing that, right? And so, So anyway, something like that. So what is the nature of, dark humor, which is that this process knows no boundaries, right? It covers all of the topics that are most difficult to deal with, all of the frightening stuff and all of the embarrassing stuff and all of that. Those are, in fact, you can do comedy cheaply in some sense if you just go to one of these areas where people are like deliberately blinded to some set of truths and you out them.
Yep. How do you think masks affect people wolves' perceptions of us? Would puppies born recently be affected with regard to the ability to read the behavior of strangers? So people wolf is our term for our domestic dogs, including ours here lying on the floor that you guys can't see. So how do you think that masks affect people wolves' perceptions of us?
It's a great question. Yeah. I am not sure because I don't really know. I mean, in some ways, we have argued that dogs are the most conscious non-human animals. Domestic dogs are, because they interface with us. And so in some sense, our collective consciousness extends to them in weird asymmetrical ways. And it is also, I think, quite clear that the facial architecture of dogs has evolved in response to human sensitivity to facial expressions. It doesn't mean it goes the other way around, right?
The eternal sad eyes
right.
that the Labrador gives us, even when she's obviously happy.
It results in her getting a good many things just so that we can stop feeling so damn guilty about how we mistreat the dog, which we don't. But and even she doesn't think we mistreat her.
Yeah, but her eyes tell a different story.
Her eyes tell a very different story. But all the little gestures. I mean, this dog has incredible eyebrows, right? The ability to raise one eyebrow is just on beyond any human I've ever known. But the point is, okay, we process their facial expressions, which has caused them to gain, presumably it's not a conscious control, but a subconscious control over the musculature in their face in a way that a wild animal wouldn't have. I don't know if they're processing our facial expressions. I know they process our voices.
They process our voices, and they probably process aspects of our endocrinological system that we aren't aware of.
Oh, yeah.
Given their much better sense of both smell and the addition of the other chemical scent, the vomeronasal organ, that, if we're agitated, even if we're not saying it, they may well be able to smell that agitation.
Sure.
Right? And,
hey, Mom, why do you smell frightened?
Yeah, like you could see agitation on my face, but she could maybe smell it on me.
Right, totally. I think that's likely. Now, even if they don't process our facial expressions, and this is a really good question.
Mm-hmm.
This raises all sorts of questions about, what about those of us who, are constantly joking around by saying preposterous things and, trying to keep a straight face while we do it. We're very misleading with our facial expressions. That would tend to throw a dog if they were processing them.
Well, no, only if they were processing both the facial expressions and the language. And that's imagine that they have a lot more language on board than anyone thinks.
Yeah, no, it doesn't really. It imagines that there is information in one's demeanor, and that somebody who is abusing that channel in order to make jokes is basically noise with respect to a dog who doesn't care much for the jokes, at least so far. And can't therefore read actual information about your mental state.
Yeah. But I think, frankly, the smells are less likely to lie, right? Like we as humans, as primates with less ability to sense smells, are less likely to be able to lie with them, to obscure our emotional state, our hormonal state via smells. And so they're more likely to have an active route into what we actually are feeling, even if we're not aware of it.
Yes. So if they are processing our facial expressions that we are assuming are targeted at
and they
other,
know we're liars all
right,
the time.
They're probably walking around all the time thinking, who does she think she's fooling? Right?
Like all the other apes.
Right.
That's all.
Just
None
the
of
other
the
apes,
dogs.
right? But there is a question. A dog, even if they don't process the facial expressions, they could process the fact of masks and the pattern of when we put them on and when we take them off, and how we feel about them. That we all resent them and feel relief at taking them off. And then why are we putting them on, and why don't we wear them in the house, and why do we wear them in the house when somebody comes in?
Yeah.
Right. All those things. Those are questions a dog could potentially ponder. And the problem is the dogs are isolated from each other, so they can't discuss what the answers might be.
That's true.
Yeah.
I'm not going to spend too much time worrying about that.
Yeah, I guess I won't either.
Okay. Discord question for this week before launching into the questions from today. Why are beauty standards so diverse between cultures? Is it natural genetics or marketing? For example, thin European women versus larger, more curvy hips and behinds being the rage in America. Again, lots of places to go here.
Yeah, there's a lot of everything in the answer to this question. There are certain things that are I'm trying to come up with objective language, but there's certain things that are more beautiful than other things in objective terms. There are other things which are arbitrary and are hallmarks of membership and lots of stuff that is processed. You would expect men and women to process things that are proxies for stuff that matters, right? And so
like across cultures, particular waist to hip ratios in women, regardless of whether or not the preference is for a thinner women or larger women, still the waist to hip ratio preferences are more or less stable, which is suggestive of an interest, totally unconscious, presumably, in fertility.
Right. Breasts too, although I think there's a persistent paradox with this one, which is, to a point, larger breasts are something that you would expect men to be interested in because they are a proxy for the amount of resource necessary to produce a baby, which is not a small amount of resource, which doesn't mean that the resources in the breast go into the baby, but it means that a woman whose breasts are large or larger than some threshold has those resources on board.
That's only true when you're actually actively breastfeeding.
Nope. I would say not. I would say
there's no evidence that size of breasts outside of having a baby at the breast is predictive of how much milk you can produce.
I think no, it's not a question of how much milk you can produce. It's a question of how much excess resource. So for those who are not,
okay.
so human females are the only mammals in which breast tissue is enlarged when not lactating. So that's a fascinating and important fact. But anyway,
therefore clearly sexually selected.
Right. Therefore clearly sexually selected. It is an advertisement. It is an advertisement of the presence of resources. But what I don't quite get, and I don't get it either as, a red-blooded male or as a scientist, is why above some threshold there seems to be this obsession with bigger is better, right? That doesn't add up, right? To the extent that a woman has in some way physiologically demonstrated the resources to produce a baby, that would seem to be like a checkbox rather than, the bigger the better. So I don't understand why that seems to have been a priority that many men seem to.
Well, and this will end up being a cultural difference, and it is a bit peacocky, right?
Yeah.
That the big showy TNA versus a more slender aesthetic in some cultures is a cultural difference. Some of which is ascribable to differences in resources, not so easily done in the modern era between Europe and North America, right? But in terms of cultures in which there are regular boom-bust cycles of food availability, preferences for finding beauty in more heavy-set, both women and men, would have been effectively a potential way to prevent famine, not personal famine, like starvation, rather.
Well, I sort of think it's like a Tinbergen phony egg phenomenon. So Tinbergen, who was one of the early brilliant ethologists, I think he was actually Richard Dawkins' advisor. He did an experiment in which there was a preference in gulls, which was his study organism, for larger eggs. And what he showed was that there was actually no upper limit, right? That the bigger the egg didn't make any difference. Absurd, non-egg-like phony eggs were still preferred in some way.
Even when anatomically impossible, given the size of the bird.
Right. And so I guess it's a little bit like people's affinity for sugar and things. It's like there was no reason to set a limit on how much sugar to avoid, because the presence of arbitrarily large amounts of sugar in the environment just isn't a thing until industrialization. So I think it might be something like that. I have run into something recently, which we might want to track down if you haven't. Maybe you and I have talked about it, but there is this belief that beauty standards have changed radically in the West, that is inferred from Rubenesque paintings in which women with a great deal of what might once have been called pulchritude were painted, but the recent evidence suggests actually that this may have to do with the models who were available to the painters, not the preferences. And so that in fact, this may have been misinterpreted. So anyway.
Oh, it's interesting. I haven't heard that.
For a topic for another time.
All right. Well, yeah, we could spend a lot more time on that, but we're going to move ahead to our first question from last hour. Is the world just a series of rigged games within rigged games? Humans create and defend rigged games, and competitors assert their own structures and games to be rigged for them instead. Can't blame everyone for trying.
Well, yes and no, I would say. Take romance for an example. Romance has a game theoretic structure to it, but played well and honorably, it's a collaborative game, right? There's also a way to play in an analogous space in a predatory way. And so I guess the point is, I don't think all games are alike. And the fact that everything is reducible to game-like structures or economic structures or something like this is an observation that only takes you so far, because really what we are detecting when we see rigged games is that the malignant versions of all of these things have taken over. And so if romance has a game-like nature in some way, it's playful, right? that's good. And the participants may not want to emphasize in anybody's mind that it's game-like, right? It's much more delightful not to think of it that way. At the point that you realize somebody's playing you, it's hard not to recognize the pattern that says, oh, here's the game they're playing, and they're the winner at my expense. So
right. I thought we were playing, not that you were playing at my expense.
Right. And so I guess the point is what causes us to fall out of suspension of disbelief mode and into game analysis mode is the discovery that we are not collaborating in the way that we thought that we were. And so what that means is even though the whole landscape is games, that it is the malignant versions that cause us to recognize it, and therefore we tend to see games as malignant, which is just a mistake. Right.
Yeah, no, that's good. No, this person says, Christmas is not over, not here in Norway. We have to wait for Newt for wiping the jewel out, and he'll be here the 20th day of Christmas, also known as the 13th of December? That must mean January. That must be the 13th of January, because otherwise
it would be
I
next
just
December,
have
which is
no
that's a
idea
very long Christmas.
What's going on. But okay, apparently in Norway, Christmas is not over, which is good. I imagine it's still pretty freaking dark in Norway, and you need as much Christmas Yuletide spirit as you can get.
Sure.
All right, next question. What are your thoughts on commercial pet diets and vaccinations? Can you share the best diets out there? What are your pets eating? Thank you for spending your Saturdays with us. It means a lot, and it's greatly appreciated. Thank you. The pet industry is a giant clusterfuck.
Yeah.
The pets themselves are not. They're awesome. Everyone should have pets if they can. They are super wonderful and helpful in getting through all sorts of madness. But veterinarians have become, through no initial fault of their own, so responsive to market forces, unable to make a living except by charging for all sorts of things that animals don't need, and just basically being pill pushers the way many MDs are now. Our animals are fully vaccinated, but I don't know. I think they're asking for one of them to get a flu shot. Honestly,
Fairfax is actually anti-vax. He just really doesn't like shots.
I actually, for the first time now, I'm hearing about a flu shot for, I don't even know why it would be one and not all of them. Maybe it's just because it's the dog and not the cats. But no, they haven't had flu shots, I don't think. But they've got all of their lifetime, or you need a titer every 2 or 3 years shots, and they always will, because they do spend some time outside. Pet diets, man, we don't.
It's a disaster.
It's a disaster, and we don't spend the time to not give them commercial food, because you got to have a life.
Yeah.
But it's a disaster, and it's all full of garbage, and it's terrible for them.
But it's not even like full of garbage the way junk food is full of garbage.
Yeah.
There's something physiologically dangerous in the pet food supply, and you can just see this in the number of pets who just mysteriously end up having some allergy to their food. Something is off.
Yeah. Oh, well, your cat just developed a chicken allergy. Just developed a chicken allergy? What are you talking about?
Yeah.
Cat's been eating chicken for 6 years. Well, it's just developed a chicken allergy.
Just developed a chicken allergy, which, so basically what this means is stuff that's in the gut is being exposed to the immune system, which is not supposed to happen. This, I believe, is analogous to what happened to me with wheat.
Yeah.
Right? Mm-hmm. And so basically the question is, what is exposing stuff in the gut to the immune system? Right? That's the question. And maybe it's the same thing for the pets that's happening to people, that's causing so many of us to be allergic to things that we otherwise would normally eat. Mm-hmm. But that's the real question. And, you've got some kind of dysfunction, and it's especially likely to show up in pet food because pet food is especially likely to be less well regulated than human food.
Yeah. And it's going to have a lot of filler in it. And the fact is, especially for cats, but also for dogs, you should expect, I don't actually know if it's true, but the prediction is that you'll have less of a problem with the diets and the foods of animals that are omnivores in the wild. Like if you've got a rabbit or a guinea pig or something, than if you've got one of these carnivorans and your pet food has any filler at all in it. Increasingly there's a lot of grain-free pet food available, and it costs a little bit more, but that's almost certainly worth doing. But even the non-grain-free stuff has stuff in it that at least your cats wouldn't be eating in the wild. Cats don't eat sweet potatoes in the wild.
Yeah.
Sorry, they don't. So it's, is it bad for them inherently? Not necessarily, but is it the sweet potato that in one in 50 cats creates a leaky gut syndrome?
Yeah.
Maybe. Probably not for dogs. Dogs are more omnivorous, and they do more sharing of food as well in their wild state, and so probably also have a more robust sort of gut biota also. So, boy, it's a disaster.
Yep. Could be the fillers, could be the pesticides on the crops, could be other stuff in our environment, could be off-gassing furniture that causes physiological reaction, that inflammation that causes the immune system to see stuff. We'd be wise to figure out how to wield precaution more effectively, because we are suffering from its failure.
Yeah. I mean, I guess one thing we do is when we cook, for instance, a whole bird, like a turkey or a chicken, we tend to not spend a ton of time getting absolutely all the meat off the bones. We will make the carcass into stock, and then we will take that carcass after we've pulled off all the rest of the resource for us to use for soup or for the base of whatever we're going to use, freezing stock. And then we will take all the rest of the remaining meat and give it to the animals, such that there's essentially no waste. And it's great for them. It's real food. It's honest. It's actual meat. And it doesn't have anything else in it.
Yeah, but don't give them the bones after you've cooked them.
Right.
I don't know how good advice that is. We've certainly been given that advice, but I don't think it's safe.
Yeah.
I don't know how dangerous it is, but it's not the same as the raw bones.
Yeah. All right. Hi, guys. There has been research showing that richer nations are more accepting of gay people than poorer nations. Is there any idea why less wealthy nations are generally less accepting?
Yeah, again, this treads into territory that I hesitate to keep kicking the can down the road, but I just think there's no alternative. I think there is a good reason for the pattern, but it probably isn't the pattern that you think it is. In other words, there's a question of in what way gay people are accepted. And that's all I'm going to say. And we will come back to it when COVID allows.
That's right. Blame COVID.
Blame COVID. Yep. Yes.
All right. Why not? It's not going to fight back. Wait.
No, it's...
Yeah. Okay. Aside from the issue of censorship and suggestive algorithms, what risks do you see for the common person, that is, people who are not in the public eye, who continue to use Instagram following the new terms and conditions announced in December? I am not on Instagram. I don't know. I mean, I assume they're doing the same shit that everyone else is doing, but I don't know what specifically Instagram is doing.
I don't either, but Instagram is owned by Facebook.
Oh, right. Right. Okay.
As is WhatsApp.
Facebook is owned by WhatsApp.
I
mean,
Facebook
owns WhatsApp. Yep.
Yes. So I don't know what these restrictions are. In a very general sense, across all platforms, there's less risk to you if you are not dependent on these platforms to reach your audience, or worse, to earn your livelihood.
Yeah.
But obviously, civilization depends on people who are reaching audiences and earning livelihoods. So in some
update to Instagram's terms of service and everything is not about that. It's more about having access to like your phone's data and such. I don't know the specifics. But.
Yeah. So Zach is telling us something about Instagram's updated terms of service has something to do with access to your phone. I know that WhatsApp recently updated their terms of service in a similar way, allowing Facebook to access more data from, ostensibly what takes place on WhatsApp is encrypted. Presumably it is, but that doesn't mean that the metadata isn't awfully valuable. So what I would say is the smart kids are on Signal, and I wouldn't use WhatsApp, and I wouldn't depend on Instagram. And we will talk more in future live streams and podcasts about what wise people can do to shore up their technical lives, because we are behind the 8 ball.
Yep. Why do you think rapid antigen stripe tests were not used by any government around the world to avoid having lockdowns? If everyone would be able to test themselves every day, wouldn't that lower drastically the number of infections? So rapid antigen stripe test as a phrase here, it looks like it might be a term of art, and I don't know it as a term of art, but I can imagine, what I think it means if it's not a specific reference. There was talk sort of early mid, I don't know, May, June, about these being available and deployed. And clearly, we were having conversations with people at that point, like, this is what we need. I don't know the state of whether or not they ever became, like, if the problem was one of development or deployment. And those two, which one of those it is makes for a very different answer to why not, right? Like, were they never developed? Maybe because it actually proved to be very, very difficult. I honestly don't know which of these is true. Or were they developed but not deployed, in which case it's going to be a political, it's going to be a will of the government issue.
Yep. I don't know. I would say I think there needs to be, it's not really a post-mortem yet, but there needs to be a deep analysis of how we got COVID so wrong.
Yeah.
And I would say one of the huge issues for me is the low quality of testing in general, right? The difficulty of accessing it, the slow speed of results, the large
Questionable
number
use of PCR testing,
false positives, false negatives, all of these things. And basically the point is, look, if your problem is that you're in danger of crashing because you're blindfolded, job number one is getting the freaking blindfold off. And the fact of not knowing who is sick when is making this all the harder to deal with. It is fueling irresponsible conspiracy stuff. It raises the possibility of shenanigans being played politically. So
it makes everything more tribal.
Right.
Wear your mask when you're in the park.
Right. Well, to take one example, we have these new strains, at least one new strain, that is showing a higher degree of transmissibility. I have not seen a good analysis on how that works. I know from studying trade-offs that it will have borrowed from somewhere, right? It will have borrowed from somewhere, and that somewhere could be a standard somewhere, or it could be a non-standard somewhere. But it could, for example, be that more transmissible than standard SARS-CoV-2 is a result of the fact that it's better able to transmit outdoors. In other words, if we are lulled into a false sense of security because the strain that we got used to has certain quirks that allow us to do certain things, and some virus were to depart from that pattern, it would for a while be more transmissible. It doesn't mean that it's more capable, right? It will, maybe it's less transmissible indoors, more transmissible outdoors, and we are of a mindset where we think outdoors is safe. So I'm not saying that's true, but
just asterisk. I not to say it's not possible, but I have an impossible time imagining how a virus that transmits basically respiratory airborne particles could simultaneously become more transmissible outdoors and less indoors.
Well,
like I don't.
If it was optimized,
there may be some mechanism. Okay.
Let's say that this was a gain of function escapee from the Wuhan lab.
Mm-hmm.
The experiment that generated it, or the set of experiments, were done indoors, so it would have been optimized inadvertently for an indoor environment. And then to the extent that there is some sort of slider, right, in which a bias towards what you're optimized for moves towards a compromise, it's not that it would necessarily lose anything recognizable indoors. It would just be slightly less tuned to it, because it would effectively have borrowed from its outdoor transmissibility to get so optimized for indoor transmissibility, which is anomalously high.
Again, I don't it's possible there's some mechanism I haven't imagined, but the high indoor transmissibility seems to be about this, this metaphor that you've used of the bucket filling, that it's about boundary layers and density of particles. And, you're indoor in a room without good airflow, and there's nothing the virus can do to change the fact that you're indoor in a room without good airflow. If someone else is breathing out viral particles, they are going to stay in that room and get more dense over time as someone continues to breathe them out if there's not good airflow.
Okay, so here's how you do it. This is not based on evidence. This is just proof of concept that something can fit this space.
Mm-hmm.
We know that outdoor transmissibility has been very, very low. We also know that sensitivity to UV light is very high, but we know that those two things are not the same property.
Right.
In other words, even at night, it appears not to transmit outdoors. So it's not just the UV sensitivity.
Mm-hmm.
Now, suppose that what happened in these novel strains that are more transmissible is that some sort of pigment or other robustifying element was introduced that made the particle more durable in the presence of UV light, but less transmissible because some percentage of the time, whatever molecular coating it was.
Or it's heavier and it drops faster.
Exactly.
Okay.
Something like that. So that means it's not like it's lost a skill that it had indoors. It just means that something is making it a little
But
harder.
more of the stuff in the bucket is on the floor. You're not going to run into it.
Right. I mean, it's exactly like, you take your umbrella into the world. Carrying an umbrella makes you slightly less fast if you have to run, and it makes you substantially more capable of staying dry if it starts to rain.
And we all know it makes it less likely that it will rain. This is established, right?
I quibble with the "we all know" part of that, but I agree that there is rain, that it exists, it happens, and sometimes
a concession. I heard a concession in there.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Right.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure exactly what this question means, so I'll show it to you as well as I read it. Hi, Bret and Heather. I am white-pilled on the Capitol. It's weeds out the authoritarians within our government and political parties. What do you think? So I think there's a typo or a missing word or something in there, and I'm also not sure what white-pilled is referring to. I know red-pilled and blue-pilled. We, in fact, recently rewatched The Matrix for the first time in a long time with our boys.
Yes, red, white, and blue-pilled. I also have not heard white-pilled.
So I don't know what white-pilled means, and I'm not sure what the rest of this means. But this person asked it twice, so I put it in here.
Yeah, I really wish I understood it. I mean, I'm especially confused by the idea of it. I think it's supposed to read, "It weeds out the authoritarians." What weeds out the authoritarians?
Yeah.
Go to the Urban Dictionary definition of what. Actually, you want me to show it to you?
You can, but I think the rest of the phrasing in the question is obscure enough that it's not necessarily going to help. White-pilled, the moment or series of events by which a person abandons despair and surrenders to the inevitability of hope. Not out of sheer optimism, but from facing difficulty and nihilism head-on through the use of reason and inquiry. It is the final destination of those who are red-pilled and black-pilled, and tends to happen when a person becomes cynical of cynicism and skeptical of skepticism. It is named after the white-hot fire of hope in a pill form, and it's medicine for the soul.
So is it not in
it's
some
based
way...
on C.S. Lewis.
Is it not in some way related to... one pill makes you larger and one pill makes you small?
Not Lewis Carroll, C.S. Lewis.
C.S. Lewis,
Yeah.
you're right. So it's some pill lost in the back of the wardrobe.
Yeah. I think it was probably his religious and philosophical writing rather than The Witch in the Wardrobe. But
if it is not close kin to the First Against the Wall Club, right? The First Against the Wall Club is the embrace of the idea that you can't really protect yourself from the vindictive authoritarianism that's coming, and so you might as well lean into it.
Although I got to say, there's a line in there in that Urban Dictionary definition that Zach pulled up that I was just reading from. Abandon. What was it? Something about cynicism and then something about skepticism. And, you, in your teaching, used to explicitly, one of the earliest assignments that you would give to students in many classes was ask them to write about, define, and explain
the relationship between cynicism, skepticism, and faith.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was one that turned people's thinking on its head.
And it is brilliant. And, to simply object anything that comes your way is to have a cynical perspective, and to simply accept anything that comes your way is to have a faithful perspective on, within some context. And to be skeptical is this middle ground, which says, maybe not, let me see what other evidence there is. And so the idea of abandoning skepticism seems like a very dire choice, no matter what the conditions, but certainly right now.
Right.
Do not abandon your skepticism.
Now, some people will disagree, resulting in a skeptic schism.
Yes.
All right. That's not worth anything, but it was fun to say.
Nothing.
I didn't even know if I was going to be able to say it. I thought I might.
Yeah, skepticism.
Skeptic schism.
Skepticism. Yeah, I couldn't say it.
Yeah, it's difficult.
Yeah. Are there Are there any missing links, outliers, or any other deviations in species that have made you question the core of evolutionary theory itself and consider alternative explanations, parentheses, I'm not a creationist?
Yeah, I would say no. There are
That
certainly
was very Californian of you. Yeah, no.
no. There are certainly some impressive gaps, right? Now, at
Sure.
least let's just take the gaps amongst the living taxa.
But the gaps don't render important.
Imagine that you
caveats.
have a tree, a phylogenetic tree, and it has lots of taxa on it, right? And then a lot of time passes, and one of the processes is an extinction process that leaves some taxon isolated. The other creatures existed, but they've gone. And in fact, this is something we should expect, because the process of adaptive radiation, the thing that causes an ancestor to produce a whole bunch of species, right? That's a species increase process. And then time creates, so you basically get exploration of design space, and then you get the elimination of some of these things, which were good enough to work for a while, but not durable to last for the long term. And so, you can get a very big exploration with lots of taxa, and then you can get a lot of loss. And then if you have a process that lasts long enough, you get things like, the order Tubuli dentata, the aardvark, right, which is totally alone.
Oh,
Well, I mean, yes, it is
so lonely.
there are other aardvarks, so it's not that lonely. But
That's good.
but in any case, so the point is,
what would be surprising is if we had uniformity of organisms across time. Sort of demarcating every 100,000 years or something what it looked like at that point. Like that's not how geology works. That's not how weathering works. That's not how therefore the fossil record works, and it's also not how the evolutionary process in the first place worked. So
Yep.
Where are we to find consistent evidence with no gaps in any way? That actually would seem to be the kind of evidence for a creator that is often trotted out as like that's what you need in order to prove that evolution is true. It's like, no, that would be bizarre. That would be statistically so unlikely.
Yeah. Impossible.
Yeah.
All but impossible. So, there are things we mentioned on our last podcast, I think, the clade that includes hyraxes, which is something that looks like a rodent. It's not, but hyraxes, elephants, and sirenians, dugongs.
Don't the hyraxes have nice teeth?
They do have very pointy teeth, and what they don't have is rodent-like teeth. So the diagnostic characteristic of rodents is these ever-growing incisors, which the hyraxes don't have. But anyway.
And they lack canines. Rodents lack canines diagnostically, and hyraxes don't.
True. Now, the point is, elephants, manatees, and hyraxes, that's a pretty widely separated group of taxa. They don't have similar niches in any way.
They're each other's closest living relatives, but
Right.
that doesn't mean that they, they can interbreed.
Right. Oh, yeah.
Right.
Not remotely close enough for that. So anyway, those sorts of gaps are natural, and we have them. But the other thing that you and I we are old enough as biologists to have seen gaps that seemed impossibly large get closed by fossil discoveries. And in fact, we were lucky enough to be at the University of Michigan when Phil Gingrich came back with his initial fossil finds that showed exactly what creationists used to mock evolutionists about, which was the claim that whales were ungulates. And so
the whales had returned to the sea. It was a secondary return to the sea from an ungulate ancestor.
Right. And so there used to be creationist literature mocking evolutionists in which, a whale on legs was wandering to the sea, which is, of course, nonsense. But what Phil Gingrich found were fossils in which you had whales that had legs that were in the process of being reduced over time. And there are now quite a number of these fossils. I would point out.
Just as you have tiny little femurs in very basal extant snakes early in development, like boids. Boids have tiny, tiny little femur bones early in development.
Because they are lizards that lost their legs. They're not the only taxon, but the most speciose taxon that did. So anyway, this is So we were there. Phil Gingrich was at the University of Michigan. Phil Gingrich found the fossils. Newt Gingrich has never found a significant fossil in his entire career.
Yeah, and guess what? You're going to love this. Those two Gingriches spelled differently.
What?
I know.
Oh, man. All right.
Yeah, I knew you'd like that one. Okay. Trump's ban will directly hurt free speech in authoritarian regimes like Russia. They'll justify harsher censorship and restrictions by pointing to the U.S. I, incidentally, writing this, am from Russia. Love you both. Thank you.
Yeah, it's
Yeah, that's right.
This is a huge setback for all of us.
Yeah. Man, there's so...
55 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. So we had a ton of questions this last hour, and we're not going to get to a majority of them, including many, many good ones. I will read one more here, and then we'll move into the questions from the next hour. To what extent do you think that overfeeding the algorithm leads to Capitol storming and BLM riots?
Overfeeding?
That's what it says.
Probably means overfitting.
Oops.
I think there is a kind of, so I'm going to just guess at what this question means.
Okay.
I think the question means, to what extent does verificationism result in things like storming of the Capitol and what else?
And the Black Lives Matter riots.
Yeah.
So, the extremists on both sides.
I think it accounts for a huge amount of it. And that basically the point is you've got a chaotic, noisy environment in which that which is captured on film and that which isn't is arbitrarily distributed. And if your mindset is looking for evidence of, let's say, rampant white supremacy, you'll find it.
Mm-hmm.
If you do a scientific analysis that says, is there rampant white supremacy? You won't. And so we are all born verificationists. That's the natural thing to be. You have to learn the sophistication of being a falsificationist, which greatly upgrades your ability to sort pattern from noise. And people who are not aware of that and just simply are looking around trying to make sense of the world naturally default into verificationism, which makes them easy prey for those who are selling overly neat stories.
Yeah.
And so, yes, I think it plays a huge role.
That's right. Okay, Zach, did you put a line in here for me, or should I figure out? I'm not seeing it. Oh, wow. Yeah, we had a lot of questions. Okay. First question from the next hour. After a no question contribution in the amount of $42. Thank you. So we've already got our answer. Isn't the only story... What?
Nothing, sorry.
Isn't the only story here why the Capitol wasn't defended by more than a few mall cops? And the question, why was that allowed to happen?
It is certainly a question, and it's one I have asked and wondered about. There are, of course, nefarious possible answers, and I don't think mall cops is the...
Yeah, that's not
that's not a fair description.
Yeah.
You had the Capitol Police who were overwhelmed. You have the question of why there was not, and then you had, I think, Virginia State Police who were brought in large numbers. And there's a question about why the National Guard was not present early on. And I don't think we know the answers to this. I am not convinced that in an environment in which this event is, the lightning rod in a polarizing debate over, how authoritarian to be and who is allowed to speak, I'm not convinced we're going to get a fair analysis of what took place.
Yeah.
It's hard enough with something like COVID, which ought to be completely nonpartisan.
And it's slow. Like that's a slow moving nightmare.
Yeah.
As opposed to, some hours of chaos. And I think, so it sounds like the conversation that you had, the second conversation that you have posted to DarkHorse Podcast that you had with Jeremy Quinn yesterday is now up.
He's now live
on YouTube. And he, as someone who was on the ground, I haven't listened to your conversation yet, but does he speak to what he saw as the police presence there?
Yes. And he says, he says a number of things about being surprised so apparently there was no ability to communicate. Cell phones were not functioning at the time because there were so many people present. So the cell architecture was overwhelmed. But he was very shocked to discover how the event had been cast in racial terms when he got back to the internet, and he was shocked at the portrayal about the police effectively having let this whole thing happen. And he says it's nonsense as a portrayal, that he saw pushback, and he saw a lot of variation, and that basically that's a cherry-picked analysis, which doesn't explain why there wasn't sufficient police presence to prevent it. But the idea that police just let this happen, he says, is nonsense.
Does birth order, rather than mom's age, influence the occurrence of gestational diabetes? Is it a heritage of interaction between mom and previous embryos? What else can be influenced by previous embryos? Homosexuality? This is from Echo. Super interesting question. I do not know the answer specifically with regard to gestational diabetes. It is known that embryos leave markers in mom. And I believe, I'm doing this off the top of my head, I think the evidence for that is that women who carry male fetuses end up having some Y chromosome produced stuff circulating in them even after they've given birth, or that shows up again at the point that they become pregnant again. I don't remember exactly what it is. So the idea that homosexuality is about something happening in the womb seems unlikely to me. You just don't need to go there to explain sort of birth order effects. And
well, there is a birth order effect, but
to explain birth order effects, you don't need to go to gestational stuff.
Yeah.
Right. With regard to homosexuality.
Well, I'm not sure. I don't know that we need a physiological explanation, but it is certainly very interesting. The older brother right hand rule, which has been demonstrated multiple times, says the more older brothers you have, the more likely you are to be gay if you're male, so long as you're right-handed. It's a fascinating pattern. That does not imply that it is a physiological distortion of the birth environment or something like that. In fact, I think it's probably an adaptive pattern in which something
in
about
the natal
the system.
home, right?
Yeah,
and I mean the prediction of what I was alluding to and what you are now stating explicitly, that there's no reason to think it's gestational. The prediction would be that a later born right-handed son who was adopted out at birth would not have an enhanced likelihood of being homosexual.
Well, but I leave open the I mean, it's possible that this is known, and I just haven't looked into it recently enough to know the answer. But it could well be gestational, but it doesn't have to be a distortion of the environment. Now, there is a set of processes that will distort the environment, which has to do with the work of David Haig, primarily about the conflict of interest between mothers and fetuses over resources. And I would point out, most of you are probably not going to know what the hell I'm talking about here, but I would point out that the conflict of interest exists. It is inherent to the fact that the mother and the offspring are not 100% related to each other. But the degree of that conflict is very different in the case of a monogamous bond in which all siblings are full siblings, rather than a polygamous or promiscuous system in which siblings are presumed to be half siblings.
So let me just provide an actual example from, I think, Haig's probably that first 1993 paper, although he's done a tremendous amount of work, as have others since then, which found that, so it's about genes being imprinted. The idea is that genes actually retain, and I'm going to speak as if they're conscious, and of course they're not, retain a marker of which parent they came from. And so you can have a maternally imprinted gene that is identical in terms of its spelling to a paternally imprinted gene, except that one of them came from mom and one of them came from dad. And that these different alleles, maternally imprinted versus paternally imprinted, will code for different kinds of, for instance, rates of development in the developing fetus, wherein A mother with a fetus inside of her wants very much for that child to thrive and survive, but is also interested in her own health long term and her ability to continue to produce more children down the road. Less so that analysis changes the closer to the end of her reproductive life she is. And the father of that fetus, if he is in a pair bonded relationship with a mother, has a very coincident interest as the mother does. But if this is a one-off thing and the baby is never going to meet its dad, the paternally imprinted genes in that baby have an interest in that kid laying on as much as fat as possible and getting as big a head as possible before it's born, which renders it more likely to be more successful after birth, but also renders it less likely to provide its mother with an easy birth and more likely to actually harm its mother on birth. And so you get maternally imprinted genes pulling resources slightly away from the kid so that mom is more likely to survive birth intact and be able to produce more kids later, and paternally imprinted genes, especially in polygynous societies, pulling towards putting more and more developmental speed on the kids when they're still in utero, such that the maternal health is downgraded relative to fetal health.
So, in effect, what you have is an arms race between fetus and mother, and this results in fetus, which has access to the mother's bloodstream, using chemical signals to try to increase the liberation of resources, and the mother turning down her sensitivity to those messages so that she doesn't
Can't hear you.
Right. But
Yeah.
the point is, you get these two systems, you get something broadcasting too loud and something not listening at all. And the point is, this is at least one of the root causes of the illnesses that go along with gestation. I would also point out, though, this is such a deep rabbit hole, but
Yeah, we're not really getting at the question, but hopefully Echo will be satisfied with this.
in effect, you have what we have described as the two reproductive modes of males. One of them is collaborative and the other is predatory.
Yep.
And the point is, the predatory one results in things including gestational disease.
Yep.
Because a male who has a one-off sexual encounter with a female does not have an interest in her future offspring doing well. In fact, they're competitors with the offspring he's producing. So it is inherently of a very different type, which goes back to our discussion earlier of different kinds of games, collaborative and competitive games. And, unfortunately, we're stuck with a situation in which love and romance are being pushed in the direction of this predatory game, which is part of the reason that the landscape is so dysfunctional.
Yeah, let's play games, but let's make it collaborative.
Yeah.
Deal.
All right.
Bret. That's all. No. It's been a long day.
I was beginning to hear voices.
Bret, have you considered if capitalism is one of those things which helps us when we're young and kills us when we're old? Why are we allowed to cherry pick the Bible and vice versa for Marx? I think the vice versa for Marx means helps us when we're young. No, hurts us when we're young and helps us when we're old.
No.
So
Right.
There's three things here. I'm not sure what the vice versa for Marx is referring to, the Bible or to capitalism in this case.
Well,
Anyway.
so not allowed. We are allowed to cherry pick in the Bible. In fact, you have to get a coherent story because it's self-inconsistent. But with Marx, you're not allowed to take the good and dispense with the bad, which I agree with that. There's some valuable stuff in the Marxist analysis.
Well,
and there's
and we
nothing
talk
good in that
about
prescription.
Yeah, needing some systems that are socialized without in any way arguing for an entirely socialized society.
Yeah.
Right?
So my quibble here is going to be that and I think I just went through this on the Trigonometry podcast. I hesitate anytime anybody wants to attribute anything to capitalism because I don't know what they mean, right? And I think the thing is, if capitalism is as broad as markets, then you can't dispense with it. And so, markets are a gift. They need to be well enough regulated that they don't produce massive amounts of harm, which is what happens when you don't regulate them. But in any case, yes, the process you're alluding to, where processes involved in our markets, and I would say the interaction between our markets and our political system, cause this senescence-like process where things that are profitable early and have massive late harms tend to be unstoppable, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the process we've described. Now, earlier this week, I had another thought, which I need to flesh out a little bit, about the other side of this process, which I didn't realize, which is that there's a tension in bodies which mirrors a tension in governance that is the driving force that causes this senescence process. So it has to do with continuity of governance in the civilization case being analogous to things like tumor surveillance in bodies. But anyway, more on that later.
You just said that the deep state is to tumor surveillance as governments are to bodies?
No, let's put it this way. Tumors are bad. The things that correct for tumors cause us to grow feeble with age and fall apart.
Mm-hmm.
And that all of that the whole thing has an analogy to the civilization context. Okay. And I believe all you would need to do is get it and then spend enough time to realize that it's true, to recognize where we have to go. That this process, the games we are playing in political space, cannot possibly address this problem, and the end is coming if we don't escape this story.
Well, that sounds like that should move to the top of your to-do list.
Yeah, it's pressing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Because to me, I have not yet, that doesn't yet sound operational.
No, it's not. But, well, we've talked about the solution. The solution involves the recognition that the values of our system need to be rescued from the vessel, which is out of date. Mm-hmm. And so, instead of the Constitution sucks or the Constitution is sacred, the values...
Okay, but rescued from the vessel which is out of date is not operational in terms of what new vessel shall be created and how.
The equivalent of a child. We need to have the new system born from the old system before the old system dies. Anyway, it's fourth frontier stuff.
Yeah, I think you and I may disagree about what operational means.
Well, let's put it this way. You certainly wouldn't want, I think the recognition of the process and the broad brush that suggests what we have to do, revolutionary change without revolution, mm-hmm. That's about as operational as you need to get. Because until we're all on board with that idea, you don't need the operational. It's like spending a lot of time terraforming Mars before you have a rocket that can get you there.
I'm not sure I agree with the analogy, but maybe. All right. Do you think the UK's appointed for life House of Lords gives us some protection against rent-seeking and combative politics that your Senate does not?
Yes, and yeah. it will have both.
I do too.
It will have benefits of this type, which is of course why our Supreme Court is appointed for life, and it will have costs.
Right.
And none of these structures is perfect, mm-hmm. and it's all trade-offs.
Yep. Philomimetic analyses have been seen for legislation originating from ALEC caps. Who can provide such analyses for the Patriot Act and the upcoming response to January 6th?
What was the ALEC connection there?
I got to remember what ALEC is.
ALEC was a corporate legislation writing process, I think.
Yeah, so I'll look it up. But philomimetic, it's not a word I've ever heard before. Philomimetic analyses have been seen for legislation originating from ALEC. Who can provide such analyses for the Patriot Act and the upcoming response to
I see. So 6th. What they're saying is that one can deduce the source of legislation by looking at elements of the way it's phrased, basically, that you can deduce heritage. What does ALEC stand for?
American Legislative Exchange Council. Mm-hmm. And right at the top of their page, they have the ALEC statement on the events of January 6th, 2021.
So the question is a good one, which is when you have these diabolical pieces of legislation, how much can you figure out about where they actually came from and therefore whose interests are being represented?
Yeah.
So yes, I think it's a great idea, and I don't know who can produce it, but it should be somebody's focus. Somebody good.
Yeah. Heather nailed it with the word futility. Do you have any recommendation for how to help? Volunteering, or is there a pill I can take so I can learn to stop worrying and love the new world order? Yeah, we're all Huey Lewis now.
Yeah.
We need a new drug.
We do. And it just never shows up.
Never.
Look, yes, the remedy, to the extent there is one, is just the recognition that we're all in it together, right? That's where the comfort comes from. And the horror of it is, there's nothing to be done about it other than to confront it. So I think this goes back to what you read of Thich Nhat Hanh and the question earlier about white pills and the even earlier allusion to the First Against the Wall Club. But the point is, okay, let's stop avoiding the obvious. Authoritarians are on the march. They're jeopardizing everything on which we depend, and we don't have any choice but to prevent them from trying to bring about their utopia, which will, of course, be dystopian in a novel and yet highly familiar way.
Yeah. All right. Where did you say we're at, Zach?
We're at an hour and about 16 minutes.
Okay. Let's do these next three. Two of them are really just comments, and then we'll close up for the week. Wouldn't the Capitol attack be terrorism, given Oxford's definition? Quote, the unlawful use of violence and intimidation, especially against civilians, in the pursuit of political aims. The mob did want to intimidate the politicians, did they not? You were saying that basically there's a legal standard for which terrorism has a legal definition, and the fact that the OED may say, I assume this is the OED's definition, may say something that does not fit that legal standard doesn't mean that the legal standard doesn't exist.
It's not even a legal definition, I would say. What it is a trigger of an other world in which all protections are suspended because it is the most frightening thing in the universe. And I guess my point would be, we have protections for a reason. The idea that anything should cause us to suspend all of them, that thing ought to be something on which a huge number of eyes who are beyond reproach are, if the aliens are pointing a weapon at the earth, right? Do we want people, do we want constitutional protections to prevent us from doing what we need to do in order to fend off the aliens? No, but the point is the chances of a circumstance in which you're actually better off suspending your constitutional protections because of this, that, or the other are pretty low.
Yeah.
Now, in the case of, COVID, do we need to prioritize some things over certain civil liberties for a short period of time? Yeah, we probably did, and we blew it. But the point is, you can't have a term that everybody thinks they know what it means, and everybody is using it to describe anything that they think is really bad, right? Yeah. And then it triggers this legal suspension of all sorts of stuff. And most diabolical of all, when you start delving into what the trigger causes to move into motion, the FISA courts and warrants, basically you've got this these powers housed in the executive, which are absolutely dictatorial. And so anyway, I don't think it's a definitional issue. I think it's you've got an emergency escape hatch from the most essential stuff that makes our civilization really awesome. And the protections that go with it ought to be, absolutely top notch and have nothing to do with whether we intuitively feel that something is terrorism. Because, were those people trying to intimidate legislators? I can make that argument, but, if I was trying to intimidate legislators, would I put on a fanciful Viking hat? It's
hard to get into the brain of that guy. I don't know.
It is, but
Yeah.
but I mean, actually, he had a YouTube channel which is now suspended. But
Well, that's a shock.
my point is, could, in a world where nothing special happened when you triggered the word terrorism, could a reasonable person reach the conclusion that these people were engaged in that? Yes. Reasonable people could disagree. In a world where that is the magic word that causes legal protections to evaporate, is it so clearly terrorism that thing ought to be triggered? No frickin' way. Yeah. So anyway, like that.
Okay, 2 last questions, comments. I can't wait for the woke to force Trumpers to wear orange armbands emblazoned with a big golden letter T. Are you both excited for re-education? Always. That's from our old friend, I'll Fight You Naked.
Yes, not excited for re-education.
No.
It
doesn't suit either of us very well.
Yes, the people who are hell-bent on re-education don't seem to know very much about the actual world, and they seem to have a chip on their shoulder. So I'm not looking forward to it.
And finally, no questions. This is a great full circle from the beginning of the first hour here today. No questions, just an acknowledgement of heartfelt gratitude for this conversation. Your words provide us with the courage to carry on. Thank you and your sons and fur people. Thank you.
Thank people, yes.
Yeah, the fur people. Some of which the fur has
You've inhaled a bit more fur than would be optimal.
Exactly. Thank you. We, I think, reminding ourselves of what we have to be grateful for and being explicit about our gratitude is very important right now, always, but especially right now.
Yeah, gratitude, catitude, and attitude, I would say.
I'm reminded of Pasta, Rasta, Disaster, which was the trilogy in the Caribbean landscape where I did a season of field work. And so you said gratitude, attitude, catitude?
I believe catitude was second.
Catitude was second.
I'm not ready to go down with the ship over that one, but it was a thought.
I think it's possible, but it may be kind of niche the way Rasta, Pasta, Disaster
Rasta,
was.
Pasta, Disaster. Yeah, I remember that place. So question, before we sign off here, very often we figure out what the titles of these episodes should be after we reflect on what we've said.
You want to do that live?
Well, there's a question.
Okay.
There's something that didn't get said in the first hour, but that might have, and I'm wondering if it would be a suitable title. And if we talk about it here, then to the extent that it leaves people scratching their heads, there will be an answer that they can readily avail themselves of.
Perhaps. What is it?
Tyranny comes at you fast. What do you think?
It does.
Yes.
It does.
All right. Well, we will talk about whether or not that might be a title as we are puzzling over such things. All right. Announcements. A, we did not intend to release the Jeremy Lee Quinn firsthand report from the assault on the Capitol in the middle of our live stream here, but the report is so timely that we felt it was necessary to get it to you as quickly as possible.
Yep.
So if you would, spread the word about the 60-second live stream. Check out the Jeremy Lee Quinn podcast, which is really part 3 of my conversation with him. Part 2 will be emerging next week.
We may be numerically challenged here at DarkHorse Podcast.
We are historically challenged in the sense that tyranny comes at you so fast that you sometimes have to report on things as they happen and then go back to editing, Zachary. The
tyranny gives not a whit about integers.
It does not.
It doesn't.
Tyranny gives a half-wit about.
It provides many half-wits.
Many half-wits. They are, you can hardly...
It empowers the half-wits.
Yep. Yeah. All right.
So, join us at our Patreons. Please consider doing so. We do a private Q&A once a month, the last Sunday of the month, at mine, where we can actually engage with the people on chat, and then we leave that up for anyone to look at who's on the Patreon at any time in the future. Bret has monthly conversations on his that are quite wonderful. You've been doing those since you started your Patreon back in the summer of 2017.
Absolutely. I've met some great people.
Yeah.
Really amazing people.
You can you should consider being a member of the First Against the Wall Club, for which you do not need to have any evidence, but there is stuff that you could get that has that image on it at the store at store.darkhorsepodcast.org.
Yep. Holly pointed out on Twitter that it was a good match for the events of of this past week.
Our friend, yes. Okay, cool.
But again, you can draw up your own emblem for the First Against the Wall Club.
That's right. And we got a great guy making clips from these episodes, and I'm sure he will be creating some interesting ones from this week's. So check out the Dark Horse Podcast Clips channel as well. And we will see you next week.
Yeah, one more thing. I would say one thing that we should be doing. There are many things we should be doing. We will revisit the question, but...
Got it.
What is it?
Going outside.
Oh, yeah, go outside. Definitely do that. But what I was going to suggest is one hedge against this rapidly marching authoritarian, tyrannical impulse is for us to start making sure that we follow people. If you follow me, follow Heather, vice versa, so that to the extent that somebody gets shut out of an environment, there's some other place through which they can get messages into the world. So, yeah.
So also darkhorse.moderator@gmail.com is a portal into ask logistical questions, really. But we probably should be re-upping our looking into alternative platforms just in case.
Just in case.
The purge continues. I mean, maybe it'll stop. Maybe it's already stopped.
Yep. I just can't see that happening.
Yeah.
But hopefully it will. Hopefully these crazed maniacs will come to their senses and stop the purge and realize what values it is that actually keep the West together. All right.
Yeah. Let's keep talking, even when we disagree, and get outside.
Okay. Be well, everyone. See you next time.